Right, hi all, it's Cal here, and gonna be discussing the our latest project, I suppose. Oh no, not our latest project, but a project that we've been working on loosely. Something of a world building thing. So this has been sort of background work for a little bit. It's a world building project that we've been thinking about doing and working on and slowly putting pieces together for. And it's courtesy of well, yeah. And inspiration struck whilst we were listening to the World Building for Masochists podcast, so thank you to them. I don't think they know who we are, but whatever, it's not important. Check them out if you're interested in world building stuff. It's really useful. It's really good information, actually. But yeah, um, we got an inspiration after listening to one of this podcast for the world that this is. So yeah, this is the basic premise was something to do with the idea of some sort of sentient asteroids or meteors, which there's a technical difference between the two, which is to do with atmospheric entry, essentially. It's something more. It's not technically atmospheric entry. It's or even capture. It's essentially it becomes a meteor once it's falling out of not just like it's an asteroid in orbit of a star or just in interstellar space, right? And then it becomes a meteor once it's definitely going to collide with a planet or other celestial body, essentially. So that's the difference there between the two, technically. So, yeah, that was the thing that we wanted to work on, was an idea that how we could make that work vaguely. Yeah. So obviously, I had to figure out something to do with this. So obviously, well, we came up with some basic ideas for a spec bio, essentially, for how it would work. Some form of more akin to sort of somewhere between fungi and plants in terms of known kingdoms. Obviously, not either technically, but somewhere in that sort of space, right? Where there's very long lived, obviously. Well, not obviously, I suppose they could be relatively short lived, but the idea is, this is something with relatively, you know, um, with a relatively long lived life cycle that reproduce essentially by, using. Essentially, right, they need the space where they can make their genetics and not actual genetics, because we haven't decided yet on genetic code on how their quote unquote genetics would work. It probably can't be DNA given mental dependence for mixing, which makes anything as vulnerable as DNA quite difficult just in that state. Plus, of course, existing in the vacuum of space without additional radioactivity protection and also makes that difficult, especially for something that long lived. So it would have to be something hardier than DNA. But the basic idea is, essentially the mix occurs it's not, obviously there's not sexual dimorphism or anything like that, because sexes don't exist. It's so much as just a matter of obviously the informational code gets mixed together and to create new ones in the mental, and then it's the use of volcanic eruptions to see. It needs to be seismically active to allow for volcanic eruptions in some way, not necessarily specifically seismically active, but something that would allow for volcanic activity in some form, or something else that provides a significant chunk of the capacity for orbital velocity for something small on its own, essentially, right? Kick something into upper atmosphere at the very least on its own, essentially, without needing to expend additional energy on that, right? And then, yeah, you get slightly more out as you do it, right? So it's a slightly population positive system, which allows for other losses to be replaced and a slow population growth. Our current idea is 1.2, but that might change, and obviously a combination of photosynthesis of some kind, right? Harvesting, radiation or energy for actual energy source, and then just harvest of space dust for other required nutrients, which is not going to get you a huge amount of material, but if you're efficient enough, you can get away with relatively small amounts of additional material, and then, yeah, it's mostly essentially just using solar style of gliding, essentially, using the, momentum, because light doesn't have much momentum, but it does have some, so you can use that for propulsion when don't need anything specific, particularly fast, right? When you don't depend on, when you don't need acceleration particularly, you just need delta V, it's very efficient. And, of course, they're collecting matter with time, so you can always eject some of that when you need faster. And then, yeah. The basic idea is obviously that, it's loosely bound, these are asteroids, right? And most of the larger asteroids are not so much a single body as they're a clump of loosely bound rocks that are sort of bound together by gravity generally, in terms of actual asteroid field, in terms of actual asteroids. That's sort of what's happening there, right? It's not a single big rock, it's a number of smaller rocks that have just clumped themselves together because of gravity, but there's not the gravitational force to essentially force them to merge, because there's not enough of them for that. That's what most asteroids are. You get some slightly larger bodies in the asteroid belts and but things like, obviously, Pluto and Charon in the outer one, and then, there is a dwarf planet in the inner asteroid belt in the solar system, but I can't remember its name off the top of my head. But yeah, that's essentially managed to compress itself down to get itself spherical, or semi-spherical. Not even, even Jupiter's not truly spherical, or the Sun, right? You don't get true sphericalism, it's just, gravity, there's enough gravity to get rough sphericalism, because there's enough matter there essentially to compress it down into a single body, rather than a collection of loosely clumped bodies, so. But the idea is obviously that you're essentially hijacking that system to some degree, right? Gives you a chunk of mass to work with, and something to work off of, right? And hold up, right, to act as a structure, a pre-existing structure, essentially, that you can work off of, and then they're using the web of, they got pneumatic tubes, right, with filia off of them for dust capture. So then, you can use that for dust capture, right, and then to move the rocks around well to each other as well. And then you can add other systems to that as well, but that's the basic premise of the primary component of the body, and then you also include photoreactive cells on the ones on the externally facing. So that gets you photosynthesis or something similar. Looking at what's more readily available, you're probably looking at sodium-ion batteries or something, biological sodium-ion batteries, essentially. And of course, yeah, that level of that photoreactivity also allows for some sort of, it's not sight in the way humans know sight, but sight of some sort, right? Because you've got photoreactive cells around the outside, right? So there's feedback on where it's getting light and what light it's getting. So, yeah. And then, obviously, given that the most common elements in the universe are hydrogen and helium, those are going to be the primary ones used for various things, right? So helium is much easier to store than hydrogen and compress and all of that, because it won't leak through literally anything, right? Hydrogen will go through solid metal, so it's kind of impossible to usefully store, really. Whilst helium you can actively store as component helium and is as its own elemental component, and is also not highly reactive with literally everything. So it's a much more stable element for the use in pneumatics and movement. Whilst hydrogen, of course, obviously is very useful for producing water, which is important for life, actually, it turns out. So, so there's oxygen available. It's not in high concentrations comparatively to hydrogen or helium, especially hydrogen, but, you get oxygen, you can produce water that way, and, of course, other exothermic reactions as well when the right chemicals are available, and it can also be used as a propellant even on its own. Not the most effectively, but, it's readily available in a way that nothing else is. Really? I mean, I say readily available. It's the least non-readily available material. Outside of stellar radiation, right, the only other thing you've really got in anything approaching readiness is hydrogen. And then, yeah, you can obviously, collect more trace materials can then be used for the production of essentially the expansion of one's body in various ways, right? Either expanding out the pneumatic net and your filia and the filia and other systems, or to increase your storage of rocks and things like that. And then, yeah, there's the neural core is buried inside one of the central rock. Obviously, not necessarily always central, but like the one central to the webbing. And then, yeah, it's just mostly just sitting there, right? Not just doing basic monitoring stuff, right? Essentially, some semi-hibernation style, just make sure nothing's going wrong, essentially, right? Just keep some level of eye out that, nothing has changed that requires you to act quickly on something. And then the use of stored chemical energy, right, allows for, you can just kick out hibernation when you need it, and then, yeah, so you can kick up the metabolic rate, essentially, and that allows for fast reaction times and a clearer picture of visual feedbacks, essentially. And then there's, yeah, also then communication wise, right, obviously because they can deposit various chemicals, right, you can use that as a form of writing, essentially. So you can leave specific compounds in specific ways in specific places to provide a written form of communication, essentially. It's not writing as we know it, but it's the same basic principle. And then the other one is, of course, because they can move themselves around, they can change the shapes of their bodies, you can use that as a form of sign language, essentially. So that's the idea there. And then, yeah, so that's the basics of what we're thinking here, and then, yeah, so, yeah, yes, so this is what, these are what you'd have reasonable-ish access to, in terms of space dust. Obviously, hydrogen and helium are both relatively readily available. Yeah. We're putting using quotes there on lifespans because that's clearly something that's... The year is very Earth-centric as a time measurement, so that's not a useful measurement for their lifespans for them, but is as external observers, essentially. Yeah. And then, yeah. So, yes. Travel ranges, essentially, unaided, right? At 0.1% the speed of light, which is very fast. It's kind of insanely fast, but also, like, you're not working with the severe limitation of being stuck on a planet, or needing, and therefore, like, if most of your acceleration is done by solar sail and by gravity slingshotting, right, you can get quite a lot of speed out of very little energy. So that gets you a lot of the way there, right? And, like, the problem is, right, this is kind of a good point as to why interstellar travel is kind of a problem for humans. because 0.1% of light speed is like really fast for anything human built, like at all, and that's still 50,000 years to get you 50 light years, which is like one star system across. And yeah, obviously, yeah. So we've been trying to think of how you could do metalworking, right? How you could achieve metalworking as as something like this, right? Yeah, obviously, like some level of orbital mechanics, at least basics of orbital mechanics, need to be an instinctive piece of knowledge, right? That's a thing that you just need to know how to do, right? Like many animals know how to walk essentially when they move, or not swim, right? A lot of animals know how to do basic motion from the get-go. Humans don't, for various reasons, mostly to do with the fact that brain too big relative to the rest of the body, and therefore we basically get born prematurely. Like, it's basically humans spec too hard into brain, and ended up humans essentially spec so hard into brain that that we end up getting born prematurely. It's kind of a problem. But yeah, yeah. So wider photosensitive range than humans because yeah, like that's how that's gonna work. And yeah, so there's nothing technological within travel range, essentially. Obviously there's a level of language needs to be taught, right? Orbital mechanics, and yeah. So a communal education in our life. Yeah, essentially there's basics of this was before we started figuring out what the systems would look like, but yeah. Yes, superconducting is very unlikely because we barely figured that out at all. And it's very dependent on very rare elements. And those get even rarer when you're not on a rocky planet, right? Because rocky planets are accumulations often of those rare elements, at least to some degree, in a way that, yeah, you just don't get in space. So, yeah, like, there's a way of you can vaguely do metalworking at the very least, right? Through the use of essentially small atmospheric, you can just if you drop something into not a truly suborbital trajectory, but something approaching suborbital, something it is technically suborbital because it will deorbit without intervention with time. But if it's multiple circuits around, right, obviously with the right dip into the atmosphere, you can get just enough atmospheric heating depending on the atmosphere that you're working with and your descent rate and all of that, right, to essentially get something to the temperatures you desire. It's very it's very complicated work like that, right? Work like that is very complicated, but right, so metal, like actual metallurgy, is also very much a very thermally controlled process anyway on Earth. Like, we do it differently, but the same basic principle of there's an awful lot of maths going into it actually at the fundamental level. Like, to do it properly requires an awful lot of maths. Essentially, it's just the same thing here. You're just doing different maths to do an orbit drop, essentially, to do an atmo dip rather than rather than doing it that way, because obviously, yeah. So yeah, and yeah, if you know orbital mechanics, right, you know things heat up when they enter the atmosphere, right? That's a thing that you know relatively quickly. So it's reasonable enough that you'd figure out the basics of it. And if you can do metal, you can probably do electricity, right? Because if you can do metal, you can do magnetism. If you can do magnetism, you can do electricity. It's yeah, and yeah, you've got iron and you've got iron available to you at least, and alu, obviously, and silicon, importantly, right? These are the important ones. Like, it would help to have copper available in reasonable amounts, but it's kind of not a thing. But it is enough for some form of silicon chip computing and photovoltaics. Yeah, and reliable web reconnection, obviously, on Severing is very important medically. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of where they are at the minute, right? Is that like, okay, cool, we're starting to figure out how to do geoscience from orbit and thinking about ways to do geoscience not from orbit. And how do we get further afield? Yeah. So their basic time unit is obviously the rotational period of their home star. It's not the home star for all of them, but like origin star, essentially. And so we've put, and then, so yeah, we've got essentially basics of what we figured out for them. So home loop is their original, is your, initial starting point, essentially. So obviously that's 0 light years away, because that's where we start. It's the F-class star, right? We've got 3,500, mostly outer belt, with then some inner belt and other way spread out. So yeah, we need to figure out what tradition would mean in some more ways here, obviously, but yeah, obviously this is like your not Imperial Corps per se, because like they're not up against anyone else. It's not an empire in the traditional sense or anything like that. It's just like, this is your core starting point. This is the cradle of civilization, essentially, and they're spreading out from here. So it's kind of the most stuck in the past in many ways. So, things are very carefully planned. There's a lot of bureaucracy built up, things like that, right? Which, yeah, obviously, yeah, I mean, it's sort of a slow decline. It's very much a slow decline because, like, yeah, cultural stagnation will do that to you, but it's very much a slow process, especially for very long-lived species. And yeah, we haven't figured out outreach. We haven't got anything useful on outreach yet, so we'll figure that out. We'll have to. And then we've got, yeah, New Home, obviously, then, and the Void Light, which, yeah, it's further away, but it's a B-class star. So it's the brightest visible star in Home Leap. So Void Light, right? And then, yeah. But being B-class essentially allows it to outshine the smaller stars that are more local. And then obviously we've got the Concealed Heat Nebula as well, which is a nebula setting slightly closer than Void Light, but still quite a distance away. And yeah, obviously being a nebula, it's very resource dense, but relatively limited in terms of useful light energy and sightlines and things like that, right? Which leads to a much more fragmented and individualized space, right? Where you really can't do the things just can't work the same, right? You don't have the same here at all, right? Like, it's very much a matter of, some people come here and stay, obviously, and then, like, there's a little bit of people coming and going, essentially, as well, right? It's a doable trip to other known systems, or to other colonies, to other systems that have other inhabited systems. So it's not like you can't make the trip back and forth to gather material from the dust cloud that is the nebula, and then leave again, right? There's not many planets here, right? There's not that, it's a nebula, so it's quite big, but, like, it's also very spread out. There's not that many people here in the first place, so, like, this is very much very early in sort of, like, there's not that many kids coming in, not directly, right? Sometimes people move quite early on in their life here, but, a lot of it is people who've moved here rather than being born here, very much so. We're talking, this is effectively first generation of sort of more permanent residents, really. It's not exactly the first, but, like, it's the first serious generation of that, rather than just sort of, like, early pioneers, essentially. So, yeah, that's what we've got so far. Yeah, so I'm gonna keep working on this, obviously, later, but, yeah, that's what we've got at the minute. This system signing out. Hope to catch you all next week. Please do remember to like, subscribe, comment, especially if you've got any questions you want answered. Be happy to answer them either in the comments or in another video. So catch you all next week.